Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. I'm Mary Shirley, and today we continue our series on whistleblowing with one of the two Theranos whistleblowers, Erika Cheung. Welcome, Erika. Will you tell us about your background, please?
Hi, Mary. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
So my background, as many of you know, I was the Theranos whistleblower, as Matt mentioned. And at the very start of my career, I had joined Theranos as a recent grad. So I'd gone to UC Berkeley. I was looking for different positions in research, in basically biomedicine, and stumbled upon Theranos at a career fair where it literally had a line out the door for people vying to get a job there. And I came into the company as an entry-level lab associate. And when I worked for the company, I went from being a lab associate to then integrating into a clinical setting. And that, at least like the bulk of what we're going to talk today, where I learned sort of my crash course in compliance, that was where my career kind of started in the very beginning.
So many of us say that we fell into compliance, and you, I think, fell into it in a completely different way than any of the rest of us.
Yeah, I like tripped into compliance. I think that's a better way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, it's, I think, what's interesting is so many people have so many different theories about why Theranos failed and how it got exposed and everything. But what I try and reason with people is a big reason is for very simple, compliance principles. So in the medical diagnostic world of like, are your quality control systems and your systems of checks and balances to make sure that your technology is working and complying with the regulatory standards to make sure that you're ensuring patient safety. It was really paying attention to those minor little details and compiling evidence in that way that was really able to expose this case of this sort of formidable company that seemed to have it all and was on this great trajectory and was going to do all these great things that no one would believed that they could possibly do anything wrong. So, so it's interesting to me to see how really paying attention very early on in my career in something as simple as quality assurance and reporting, different errors that were happening that really made the difference in being able to support my case to expose to people that they were endangering patients' lives when it was not really commonplace for anyone to believe at that time when I was, 22 or 23 years old, that I was the right one in this case, that this big company with $700 million in raised capital was kind of engaging in this behavior.
Yeah, I imagine it's even harder. You were really just a baby at the time, right? So it's not like you had a big track record behind you of all these different accolades and experience. You came in sort of expecting to learn about things, and then you reveal something.
Yeah, exactly. I came in fresh out of college, right? You are there to serve. You are trying to figure everything out. You are just so grateful that you got a job. Pretty much.
Totally.
This is the kind of perspective that I was coming from. And with that comes a lot of, I think going through the journey of working at Theranos and seeing the different red flags of things that were going on and the bad behavior of, I think through that process, I had a lot of self-doubt because I wasn't very experienced and I did have a lot to learn. And even in retrospect now, a decade down the line, when I look back, I was really, quite young and I didn't have a lot of experience. And it was hard to know if it was the case that I just didn't understand what I was doing or I lacked some sort of awareness or, after running a bunch of experiments, reporting a lot of different issues that I had seen, and aggregating a lot of information, that it was actually the fact that in the case of Theranos, the product wasn't working, that the company was still trying to launch this product into the public without their consent. It was, I think, a bit more difficult for me to have a sense of assuredness in my competency in this case to analyze whether the issues that I was seeing were the reality of the situation, to the extent that I think someone who had maybe more experience in compliance would have been able to probably pick up on much sooner and much quicker.
Well, I would say on behalf of the whole compliance community that you did an awesome job, and this experience has put you in good stead for what you're doing now. So why don't you catch us up and tell us a little bit about the work that you've started with your own company?
Yeah. So right now, what I notice is that, when it comes to startups are these fresh start companies. They don't have a lot of infrastructure. They don't have a lot of systems. A lot of people are just trying to pull whatever little resources that they have together to try and, solve problems. And sometimes with good intentions, sometimes to make money. But at the same time, often what gets overlooked are things like ethics or compliance, or how is this going to fit into the regulatory landscape as I grow and develop and be able to actually build my product further. So I noticed that there was still, not just coming out of one of the biggest, scandals, Theranos wasn't so much a startup in the traditional sense of what we think of, because it did actually have quite a bit of money. It's probably one of the most well-resourced startups in its time, back in 2012, 2013. But for a majority of these other companies, it's still very hard for them to get onboarded with this information, because they're just starting out, and there's so many pressures to fundraise, to build your product, to hire. And that was the sort of impetus of why I launched a nonprofit called Ethics and Entrepreneurship, where we're really trying to break down what are the must-haves for startup companies to embed ethical culture and ethical systems into their organizations, ideally early on, because then it makes it easier for them as they sort of scale and build out, to make sure that they make decisions based on strong values and strong principles, and that they don't end up having small mistakes boil out to really catastrophic results.
Great, thank you. And that's an interesting way you've taken your trip into compliance and decided to land there and stay there, which is super cool for us. Yeah. So we hope you're enjoying the ride. Yeah. And I'll ask you to help us with some level setting. I think the Theranos case is pretty well known in compliance circles. It's kind of famous as a case. But I'll ask you if you wouldn't mind to give a Cliff Notes version of the lead up to and discovery of the issues from your perspective.
Right. So essentially, by the time I had gotten into Theranos, it had been around for about 10 years. And initially, they were in what's called stealth mode. So the company wasn't really public with any information. I think there was maybe like 3 different media articles about the company. There wasn't a lot of visibility on what was going on, and they hadn't quite launched the product. Launching the product meaning taking their device and actively running it on patient samples. So when I had gotten hired for the company, they had just started launching and testing patient samples for, I think, about 2 to 3 months. And then I came in, and essentially, initially, they had very few tests that they could actually run on patients. They had maybe 1 or 2 with their device. It was called the Edison, that they had produced. But what my job was coming in there was to validate more tests. So basically, can we run vitamin D? Can we run thyroid panels? Can we run infectious disease panels? And are they working on our system? And then to take those blood tests that I had basically said, okay, these are validated, they're good to go, we've submitted them with regulators, and then take that technology and integrate it into a clinical setting where we were actively going to process patient samples. So initially, the red flags that I had started to see were really probably about a month in working for the company, not even that long, when I was kind of trying to validate this technology and say, is it accurate? So we know when I use a machine that's in a hospital that's approved by the FDA, it will give me a result like 20 micrograms per mil. But when I run it on the Theranos device, it's coming out like 120. So I know that this is a big problem, because this would mean I would give 2 different diagnoses to a patient, and this could really change the course of their care, right? This could potentially, in some cases, kill them. So this was kind of the first alarm bell that I had seen, is that I was sitting in these meetings watching people cherry pick data, because there was a lot of pressure to basically validate these tests, to get them live, to start processing on patient samples as soon as possible. And I just kept noticing that they were engaging in these practices of just cherry picking, which anyone with a basic science degree knows that, like, you should not cherry pick, especially because even though it might seem like you can generate a good report to send over to regulators, that you have these great accuracy rates, when you actually run it in the laboratory, it's going to mess up. Those errors are going to pop up at some point. And then that's what I started to see downstream, was now they took me off of validating these different biochemical tests within the laboratory and then starting to run it on patients. I was in charge of implementing a quality control infrastructure to basically say, before I run a patient, I run a quality control check to see, when I run, quality control that I know has a, 20 microgram per mil value into the system, does it pop out relatively the same result? And it kept saying no. It's not the same result. It's, again, 120 micrograms per mil, like we had seen in these preliminary studies before they had cleaned the data or cherry picked. And basically the whole battle was me basically seeing that every time I'd run quality controls for all these different biochemical tests, it would tell me, no, do not run patient sample. No, do not run patient sample. And it was constantly being fed all these different excuses for why that didn't need to be paid attention to, or we were doing, it was a device problem. It was a technician problem. It was a, too hot that day problem, like whatever they could manage to muster up. And I think just seeing this same error occur over and over and over and over again, and kind of trying to articulate to so many different teams within the organization that, hey, I'm seeing these issues. I had thought that maybe it was like a lack of awareness, that there wasn't good communication between executive level management and the people operational on the floor, which can happen sometimes. So I really took it upon myself and had recruited a small team internally to really aggregate a lot of this evidence to show people, look, this is how bad it is for us in the clinical lab of basically every time I go to run a patient sample, it's telling me, no, do not run this. No, do not run this on basically every other day. It was telling me that. I took it up to so many different teams internally. There wasn't any, this is a startup, so there was really no compliance team at that point in time. There wasn't really strong reporting infrastructure that I could say, hey, here's a internal whistleblower line. But I took it up to, pretty much every director in the company to try and problem solve to see what was the issue. I took it to the COO of the company, and I took it to the board to try and let them know that, hey, you guys think this machine is working, but it's really not. And I just don't think it's appropriate. It's actually awful to be testing patients right now with this device that we know has immense amount of errors. We need to pull it and just stop processing patient samples. And after kind of going through the whole rung of leadership to try and express my issues, they basically said, you don't know what you're talking about. You need to just process patient samples without question. And I left the company and decided not to work there anymore, because it just, It didn't feel right. And I couldn't be asked to do something that I fundamentally didn't believe was the right thing to do. Right. It was just so wrong to me what was happening. And yeah, that's how I ended up exiting the company. And I did, when I worked in the company, managed to shut down some of the tests. So that was good. But shortly after I had left, they got reinstated and they started processing patients again with these same kind of faulty assays. In the science world, you have to pay attention. There's a difference between signal and noise, right? And just because the machine spits out a result, you really have to make sure that that's a true signal of what someone's, health levels are versus just the noise of you've constructed this device that can give you some sort of value. And we had a lot of noise on these machines. So, yeah.
After you left, I believe you wrote a letter to a regulator. What instigated that for you? What motivated you to do that?
Yeah. So at this time, I had left the company for about 6-7 months, I believe. And I had been talking to people in the company still after I worked there. I was, I think, 22 or 23 at this time. So I had known that they had reinstated some of these tests and were still processing patient samples. But essentially, I got contacted by a Wall Street Journal reporter saying, Erika, I know you're really freaked out because everyone I talked to is really freaked out. But what I've heard is that what Theranos is promising to their patients and the device that they've claimed to have for their investors is not actually what's happening. And they're potentially endangering the lives of patients. And it was like a sigh of relief. I was like, okay, I'm not alone in this. I'm not the only person that has looked at this information and realized this is wrong, what they're doing. So from there, after that call, Theranos, having known that there was a journalist that was going to do this investigative piece, had come after a whole bunch of former employees, myself included. And I decided not to speak to them because I was like, I don't work for these people. I don't have to say anything to them. And then they decided to sic one of the best corporate lawyers on me, David Boyes at the time. And that forced me to call a lawyer because they essentially had followed me, figured out where I was living with a colleague at the time because I was moving and transitioning out of houses. They had people sit outside my work, freaked out my own colleagues, my new employers who were there. And from kind of intimidation that they were sort of placing upon me, I called a lawyer, and the lawyer kind of tipped me off, like, you can report to regulators that this is an option. And so after that conversation with the lawyer and talking to a number of other people, I decided to send a letter to the Center of Medicaid and Medi-Cal Services, which is the regulatory body in charge of approving a company of whether they can process patient samples or not. It's not the FDA. Everyone thinks it's the FDA. FDA is in charge of the distribution of medical devices, which technically Theranos was not distributing medical devices yet, except for the nanotainer. So it was the only regulatory body that could, again, what was my agenda, stop them from engaging the bad behavior of testing on patients too soon without their consent and without their knowledge. And luckily, that sparked an investigation, and from there, it stopped them from being able to process patient samples anymore.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about how this came to be in the first place. And I wanted to refer to how there's been a lot of discussion about how Elizabeth Holmes, who of course was the founder of Theranos, which she was the brainchild, was very charming and persuasive, and that is likely to have helped her cover up the issues. And one of the things that I noticed was in terms of some of the victims or the investors that were misled, several of them were very seasoned, very experienced businessmen. And so I'd like to ask you, what are your thoughts on this? And do you think gender played a part in the ability to deceive in this particular instance?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at most of these fraud cases or most of criminal cases, even, people are really charming and persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
And Elizabeth was, right?
Mm-hmm.
She had a great story. She was like this underdog case where she had basically everyone wanted to believe in her and wanted to believe in her story. And she did have this incredible way to sort of share this very strong vision that people wanted to, and myself included, wanted to bring to, right? That we were at a space with technology that we could make healthcare more accessible, that it could be more affordable, that it could be leveraged in a way to help us, see our loved ones not get so sick that it would be at the point of no return. And even for me, when I listen to her speak, even in retrospect of knowing all the things going on, I still fall for it, right? I still fall for her ability to really communicate these ideas really effectively. So I think it's not something unique necessary to Elizabeth. You see this with a lot of different people who are kind of fraudsters and engage in criminal behavior, right? They have this sort of ability. In terms of the gender role playing into it, I think, majority of the cases of fraud that have occurred have been male at this point in time, right? There wasn't anything, I think, because of gender that led to this outcome. It was the case that you had this person who made bad decisions, decided when information was brought to them that they needed to stop basically processing patient samples. If she wanted to continue just building a medical device, I'm sure she could have, but that's not what she chose to do. She chose to use this medical devices on patients before it was ready. She wasn't any different than any other person. I think the tragedy of the story and where gender does play a role is that during that time, Elizabeth was the only, female founder to be involved in a unicorn company. And I think it wasn't just the case that everyone wanted to believe that that could be possible, that she was going to make it, right? That she had broke through the barrier of going into a really hard field of a biotechnology product that tends to have extremely high failure rates. Even going into the business world, an over 90% failure rate, and that she could finally be the one person. Women make up 50% of the population, but they make 0% of the leadership in Silicon Valley, that she could do it and that she could influence other people, both investors, to believe in other women that go to found companies, and then also just for young women like myself at that time, that they could have the possibility to be able to engage in doing those things. And so I think, in terms of the sort of gender aspect of it and the tragedy of it is the fact that the fall from grace was just that much farther, because I think she was really this powerful symbol of so many different things. And I think the most exciting thing about gender is that people try and say, oh, it was because of a woman that she got away with this. And that's not the case at all, right? It's just, there's some people that end up doing things, making bad decisions, don't take responsibility for their bad decisions, and then it goes too far. And when you actually look at the number of unethical behavior and fraud cases, that is actually majority men. So that's not the case. And so there's that aspect of it. In terms of the really smart people who had come in and bought into the company and her, they were very good businessmen. They were really high profile people, but I think there's something very special about biotech that you do have to have a level of domain expertise and competency in the field in order to ask the right questions to see if the technology is working, if you have the right, compliance structures put into place, if you understand how to interface with regulators very well. It's just very specific type of knowledge that you have to have in order to evaluate these companies and the leaders who are part of these companies. That I think is what caused it to be difficult for these very intelligent people to not be able to pick up on what was going on. And then there's sort of like an effect of the more and more powerful people that you bring in, the less responsibility you think you have to sort of check up and see and do your own due diligence. Because there's this kind of sentiment that, well, you can't fool that many smart people, right? So I think there was some level of that going on too, where she had managed to get so many of these people that gave her validation that wasn't necessarily warranted or representative of the reality of the state of the company.
Do you believe that startups are particularly dangerous environments for frauds to take place? And how can compliance officers starting to work at a startup be most effective in terms of embedding an ethical culture into that organization?
Yeah, I think there are some elements of startups that they would be more conducive to things going wrong, right? And mistakes being made. Right? You don't have a lot of resources. You have an immense amount of pressure. Majority of them are constantly in survival mode. I think there are some simple things that startups can do better that will make it easier for them. One of them is hiring experienced people. I think there was this real ethos, maybe not everywhere, but especially in the Silicon Valley, of a certain type of ageism, right? Well, in order to work for these fast-paced, innovative companies, you had to be young and like agile. When really you do need some experience, and you need people who have the competency to basically help you govern over your blind spots. I think we have to be careful of moral licensing and the idea that because I'm this new innovative product and there's nothing else like it on the market, that this means that justifies me getting away with all of these sort of egregious activities because, just wait, worlds, it will be all worth it in the end. This is just the cost of what it takes in order to build things that have never been built before. And I think sometimes startups can go into that territory, and you have to be careful. There also seems to be a high level of this cult of personality, of wanting these visionary people, of wanting the next Steve Jobs. And I think that got pushed into the culture a little too much of emphasizing having these very charismatic people who can basically sell anything, even if it's nothing, right? In the case of Theranos. So I think those things, if they pay attention to them, they can do better and really execute more strongly on their visions, if they make sure that those things are going on, and also making sure that you have transparent organizations where people see problems that they can report them, right? And understand that when they report them, it might come to direct threat to whatever you're doing or your own personal beliefs or whatever else. And I think that'll produce a bit stronger outcomes, even though the environment is quite stressful and intense. And in terms of compliance officers coming in there, I think it's, being cognizant of this idea that they are in survival mode, right? They are not going to have all the perfect procedures and processes set up. So really focusing on what are our must-haves, what are those thresholds of like non-negotiable lines we can't cross, and let's start from there and move forward. And I think that's a good approach for the startup, because it's, again, playing to this, look, I'm trying to help you survive, get you to the next level so we can keep growing, keep building this thing. I have confidence that this, I wouldn't work, majority of people don't work for something that they don't have confidence in, at least I'd hope not. So I think that would help kind of build a stronger rapport and relationship with a lot of these startup founders. And also just like telling these things, right? It's analyzing the risks, right? I think you have to have a level of optimism, because if you don't, it's very hard to make it through the day when it's so challenging, but also keeping them grounded on the sort of realistic nature of like, we're looking at these risks so it doesn't ruin the business. That's it. That's our role. So I think those can be helpful, of just kind of being straightforward with people. It's not personal. It's just paying attention to the context in which you're embedded in. So.
Lots of good common sense stuff there.
Yeah.
I'll take you back to the Theranos case and to ask you, because it is really hard, and I think compliance officers probably know this more than anyone else. Speaking up does come with an incredible amount of risk. And no matter how much a company says, oh, we don't retaliate, it's perfectly fine to speak up, we encourage you to do so, it is still a fearful experience, I believe, for most people. And so I'd like to hear from you. What was the thought process in your mind when you realized that something was wrong and you were considering the decision to speak up?
This is a good question. I think, it has to do with responsibility. I think a lot of it for me, just as much as I was happy to have gotten this job and to be a part of this organization, I was spending, 16 hours a day working for this company, utilizing a lot of my valuable time and energy. And so when I really sign up for a position, I really sign the agreement that I'm going to do my job and I'm going to do it well. And I'm going to take ownership and responsibility over the things that I am told to do. And so when speaking up, again, it was this case where I don't know if I was scared, because I really fundamentally believed that the reason I was trying to communicate with people the issues that I was seeing is because I thought it was for the greater good of the company and their own mission. And for me, I just am one of these people that, I will hold myself, and I try as best as I can to hold others accountable to the things that they tell me are their standards, right? And I think that it wasn't so scary to speak up as much as I would have thought it was. I think it was scary to be retaliated against, and that was terrifying. But also very perplexing to me, because I genuinely was coming from this place of, this is the job that you gave to me, and I'm going to be responsible for the position and the role that you had. So I think that helps when you're speaking up, right? When you have a lot of evidence, when you say, I'm doing this because I really think this is in the best interest of the job that I've been told to do. And it's not personal. I'm not trying to be negative. I really fundamentally believe in wanting to make this company better. I try and recognize my own conflicts of interest of like, am I just doing this because I'm trying to advance myself, or is it like genuine that this is what I think is, I'm just in a way, I know if I advance the company, I advance myself, and I'm just sort of oriented that way. So I think these types of very simple principles have always made it very easy for me to speak up, because I just think of it in the way that like, I'm not just going to join any company to just join any company. I'm going to join one because I fundamentally have that connection to whatever it is that I'm doing. And it makes it easier to speak up even when it's hard, and to have those hard conversations, because at the end of the day, I care, right? I care. And the retaliation portion, though, now in retrospect, I can see it still hasn't stopped me from speaking up, even though it still has presented itself as hard in not just my work life, but my personal life. The retaliation was very difficult. And I think this is why I've been trying to figure out like different ways that you can help support people who do speak up, right? And who are operating with the best interests of the company at hand, and how do we implement better policies within our organizations to not retaliate towards those who speak up? How do you do it in a ways where people can maintain their anonymity so they're not scared of, you know, the rejection, the social rejection from people. They're not scared of losing their jobs. And they feel like something's actually going to be done about the complaint that they file, right? So now that's kind of emboldened me there that, with majority of whistleblowers I've realized are not like a big portion of the population. I think real tragedy about them is the fact that a lot of them, when they tried to figure out the kind of psychological motivations of why people decide to blow the whistle, is because they have something called identity fusion. You can think of it like how sports fans, like when their team loses, they feel the loss. Oddly, whistleblowers are that same way. When they sign up to do something, they kind of fuse their identity to whatever it is that they're doing. And so they really feel that even if it comes to a personal cost at them, it's okay because it's for the greater good of the organization. And I think this is the real tragedy for most whistleblowers. It's the fact that they really cared about the thing that they were involved in, and that was taken away from them. And it's like a different type of, it's like being broken up with in a way, you know, it's like being heartbroken because at the end of the day, you really did have that strong connection to the thing that you were doing. And I think this is a side of whistleblowers that a lot of people don't see. There are a couple people that just want to take companies down, but that's very rare. Very rare. That doesn't happen as often. Like those, that doesn't seem to be the norm of who decides to come forward. So,
There's a phrase that I use called compliance destiny, and it's the idea that you don't choose compliance as a discipline. Compliance chooses you. And the answer that you gave very initially when you were talking about this, in my mind, tells me no matter how robust your education in science is, which I know it is, you have the heart of a compliance professional. And so I believe no matter what happened, you were always going to end up in an ethics role. So welcome to your compliance destiny.
I think that's the thing. Like, I fundamentally love innovation. I love the fact that business is this great way to build sustainable ways that you can launch new products and services in the world, but you have to do that with some sentiment of the public interest too. And, you know, I would have never thought of it that way, that it's like, I've been chosen, you know, I've like been chosen by compliance to go into this way, but it's definitely seemed to work out that way in a very unexpected trajectory and path.
You mentioned the retaliation sucked. What was the most difficult aspect of being a whistleblower? Was it the retaliation or something else?
I think it was, I mean, it's so hard to be, there's like limitations of how self-aware I can be on this, because even the notion of calling myself a whistleblower isn't something I deemed myself. It's more everyone started calling me that. And so that has been its own experience. I think the hardest thing, it was a bit of the retaliation, but again, even that, it was so many things. One, I think the saddest case is I had joined this company because I wanted to help serve patients. And I was asked to do something that could have hurt people. And even though I stood up and did the right thing, there was some level of me that is very hurt that I was complicit in this process that I fundamentally objected to. And I think if I could have a, you know, genie and go back in time, like if this all didn't happen and I wasn't a whistleblower and they just stopped processing patient samples until they were ready to have a technology, I would take that in a heartbeat. Right. So I think that's probably the hardest part is living with this sort of bizarre fame of you did the right thing, but it was still because this bad thing happened. And that's put me in a space. I think the other hard thing is the retaliation was hard because when people are following you without your consent, you don't know when it stops or starts. And I think that's led to a lot of an immense amount of anxiety for me, because at the end of the day, Theranos was a very high-powered company. A lot of investors lost a lot of money. People lost a lot of face, and any sentiment of like Machiavellianism that could potentially come out of this has probably been psychologically something very challenging for me to deal with that I wasn't anticipating. And I think initially that's why I stayed off the record for a very long. I tried to stay off the record. It didn't end up happening because I was involved in a court case, and the judge had decided to release my name into the public record, because it's very daunting, right? When you feel like you have this sort of looming kind of dark experience over your shoulder, even though again, I'm super grateful for the fact that I came out of this healthy and well. I didn't have legal fees. I didn't have any negative consequences in any sort of way, but there's still this sort of shadow side to the experience that kind of can make it difficult at times.
I think that's completely understandable and incredibly self-aware, in fact, of you to say, I possibly at this point in time do not know the full extent of what the repercussions are.
Yeah. So we'll see, right? At the same time of being vigilant, you also have to move forward with your life. And just as I trusted myself to get through what was a very challenging experience, I have to have that same faith and confidence in my ability to make it through adversity, even if it presents itself in the future. So that's how I've tried to orient my mindset around the incident.
Beautiful reframing.
Yeah.
How has speaking up in a high-profile case changed your life, aside from the stalking, which clearly wasn't ideal?
Yeah, that was definitely not something I wish upon anyone. I've got to meet really incredible people. I think that's something that I wasn't anticipating that would be a very beautiful consequence of all of this, is that it's really allowed me to share my story with other people who are probably going through similar incidents where they want to speak up and they say something, but they might be scared to do so, to give them that ability to know that you can do the right thing and it end up well, right? Like you can, the truth can prevail. It might not happen at the time span that you want it to, but it does happen. And I think to inspire other people to stand up for what they, the right thing for themselves and others has been an incredible experience, and something that I'm really, really grateful for. My day-to-day hasn't really changed too much,
That's good to hear.
But it's always nice that that you could have helped other people feel confident in themselves when they're also in a very challenging situation. I think that's I'm happy that I've been able to have that opportunity, and that being on the record has been able to grant me that, which I wasn't probably as aware of when I first started on this kind of journey of how public, when the case started being really public.
Was there anything that you would have done differently if faced with the same situation again?
Yes, I would have reported much sooner. Collected more evidence. I would have gotten more people to jump on board with me and to do it. I would have talked to regulators way sooner. Absolutely. I would have done it way sooner. You kind of get dealt the cards that you get dealt, but I would have definitely done this sooner. I wouldn't have waited those number of months in order to report.
That's interesting. We kind of need you saying that as like a compliance officer's toolkit to persuade our colleagues. Come on, speak up. We love it.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, in the compliance world, the Theranos case is high profile, and then in mainstream media as well, it drew a lot of interest. So do you get recognized in the street for the role that you played in this?
Only in very specific context, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm in San Francisco or the Silicon Valley, that might happen. But you know what's funny? I think it's one of those things that people will say you look familiar way more often, but they can't pinpoint why. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I've noticed. Or I think a lot of people are really scared to come up to me, but they'll keep staring at me. And from the corner of my eye, I'm like, what am I doing? Why is this? So I can't tell. It hasn't, though, dramatically changed too much, I would say. I'm also very introverted, so I spend most of my day, and it has been a pandemic, so I've been pretty much inside my house this entire time. So it's not... and I'm wearing a mask when I'm outside. So
true.
Like, anyone would really know who I was in any case. So we'll see. We'll see if it happens more when we get out more into the world.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. And to wrap up with you, Erika, I'd like to ask, to help us who are in compliance officer type roles, what do you think we can do as part of our Speak Up campaigns, apart from me snipping that part with you, encouraging people to do it sooner? What can we do to better foster a Speak Up culture and encourage colleagues to come forward? And just putting it out there, I think a lot of big companies in particular do have the hotline in place. They do have posters advertising it and mentioning it in trainings, and a non-retaliation policy. So I guess that would be the bare minimum of what you would suggest. Is there anything else that you can think of?
Yeah, I think what's really important right now, because I think emotions are very high among so many different people, because there are so many things outside of people's control of, the pandemic going on, just political climates everywhere seem to be quite crazy. There seems to just be this issue of a lot of people not trusting one another. Is really this idea of being emotionally perceptive and creating psychological safety, I think, is going to be very, very important for people that are speaking up more than ever. And just making sure that when someone comes to you with a complaint, do the process of just trying to really active listen and just hear them out. And then ideally, like you said, majority of compliance officers have some sort of infrastructure for that. But I think we could all operate with a little more empathy, I think now more than ever, because of just how tense things are for people. So I think that's one way is just making sure you actively listen and try and be empathetic and just provide this culture and identity of this is a psychologically safe space. This is what we're trying to cultivate here. We want to make sure that your voices are heard, and we want to make sure that we're respectful of the diversity of opinions and perspectives that people are going to bring to the table. And I think that would be very beneficial, especially right now. I had one other point, but I kind of lost it.
Well, you spoke very eloquently on that one, so I'm willing to take it. And if it jumps out at you,
I'll chime in. But I think that's going to be really, really crucial right now. And also celebrate when people speak up. I don't think we do this enough, where, when people have the courage to have that hard conversation with you, even if it stings, even if it hurts, just being and saying, because this person decided to do something that was uncomfortable and say uncomfortable things, these are the outcomes of what that relied. And this is how it made us better. This is what we're going to learn from the situation. I think, just like bad ideas can be contagious, how can we make social behavior contagious, right? And think about that and really celebrate it and really kind of get people to sort of spread this type of behavior of being, one, comfortable with saying something, and then two, comfortable with listening to something that may be difficult to hear.
One of my favorite ways to encourage colleagues to speak up, because I think people feel like, being the bearer of bad news is terrible, we have to divert our attention to it, is explaining, when we have a problem, sweeping it under the carpet doesn't magically make it go away. It's still going to be there as a problem for us to deal with at some point, and it only makes other people who are concerned about it more likely to take it externally, either to the media or to a regulator. And when they do that, we have far less control over it.
Yeah.
Right. So we want to have an opportunity to not air our dirty laundry and fix our own problems. And so I love that idea of framing that as celebrating, as seeing it as a positive, and making it something that not only the potential whistleblowers or reporters would see as a positive, but also the people who surround them. And it's not just the managers who can dish out retaliation. You referred to essentially being ostracized as a negative consequence as well. So we want everyone to know that speaking up is something to be celebrated.
Yeah, definitely. It takes it takes the whole organization to have that kind of sentiment and buy-in.
Perfect. Well, we have come to the end, and I would love to thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. I know that our audience is going to be really interested in your story, so wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
Just to wrap up for today's session, to increase the star power, as if it wasn't enough with Erika, I wanted to share something from an individual who, for my childhood at least, was very influential in terms of the idea that young women could be independent entrepreneurs and just an absolute feminist right from the start. And if you're of the same vintage of me as me, you may also have read the Babysitter's Club books when you were growing up. And the author is a lady named Anne Martin. And so I reached out to Anne to ask her a little bit about what motivated her to include these concepts in her books. So I'm going to share that with you now. And I asked Anne, or I put to her, many of your stories and characters focused on young women being capable and independent, as well as progressive about social justice issues. And that was a little ahead of your time, given that the first books were published in the mid-'80s. Why was it important to you to empower your female characters and have them conscious of social justice issues? And Anne responded, I was fortunate to attend Smith, a progressive all-women's college whose curriculum explored issues of social justice and challenged students to make a difference in the world. When writing the Babysitter's Club books, I felt passionate about creating characters who were independent and inquisitive. The club members tackled problems and searched for solutions together with their parents largely in the background, but available if needed. My hope was that these characters would resonate with readers who were exploring their identities and learning how to navigate their place in their school, their community, and even the world. So with that, we end for today. And thank you so much for listening. You can find us on Corporate Compliance Insights, as well as any podcast player and YouTube. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care until next time.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.